Welcome to Mysteries Abound, a collection of stories about the unusual, the strange, the perplexing, and the downright odd. In our world today, mysteries abound. Welcome everyone to the Mysteries Abound podcast. This is your host Paul, and this is episode 55. This show is entitled The Reason We Find Cartoon Villains So Dastardly. But to begin the show this week, we're doing an article by Lee Spiegel from the HuffingtonPost.com. The Baltic Sea UFO hunters look to identify the mystery object. A mysterious cylindrical object is sitting in 300 feet of water at the bottom of the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Finland, and nobody knows what it is. Yet. Deep sea divers using remote-controlled cameras are heading to the site on Friday. They'll try to determine the exact identity of the object, which side-scan sonar first revealed in June 2011. My guess is they won't find anything. They may just find a large roundish rock, well-known skeptic Benjamin Radford, Deputy Director of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, told the Huffington Post. Side sonar is not a photograph, and it can create false echoes. So it's not crystal clear what exactly it is that you're recording, Radford said. The object that we're talking about is basically flush with the ocean floor, and side-scan sonar is much less reliable for things like that. In what's been compared to an episode of The X-Files, Peter Lindbergh, captain of the Ocean Explorer, and his co-researcher Dennis Asberg made global headlines last year when they presented sonar images of a nearly 200-foot wide circular anomaly, looking very much like the fictitious Millennium Falcon spacecraft from the Star Wars movies. We don't know whether it's a natural phenomenon or an object, Lindbergh told Fox News. The researchers will spend between 6 and 10 days at the site using sonar to create 3D images of the bottom of the specified part of the Baltic Sea. Explanations for the odd anomaly include a meteor, a naturally occurring gas well, and the possible remains of a 19th century Russian warship. Of course, let's not forget about all of those hopeful souls who would love this to turn out to be a crash-submerged spacecraft from another world. If this were a UFO, that would indeed be a strange thing, Asberg told Fox News. I'm just not sure, but we'll soon see. Radford, who is also the author of Scientific Paranormal Investigation, How to Solve Unexplained Mysteries, says he thinks the mystery will only continue if the divers don't find anything. Because then they'll say, "Whoa, hold on here, we have this image that was taken in 2011. How come they're going back there and not finding it there?" Radford said. And there will be conspiracies about that. And if you'd like to see a bit more, you can visit the show notes at www.origins.info, click on the Mysteries Abound show notes link, and then the link to episode 55, and then the link to this article. And in there you'll find some photographs, a 10-photo slideshow, and a short video of what's going on. And from the bbc.co.uk website, One of those little misplaced object stories. I just love these, and these ones involve fish in an egg. Biologists at the University of Manchester want help cracking their miracle discovery of 3 fish inside a sealed egg. The group found the duck egg in a small pond on a field trip to the French Alps and noticed something moving inside it. When they cracked open the shell, 3 live minnows were inside. They have enlisted the help of other experts, but despite their extensive combined knowledge, the biologists admit they are baffled. Dr. Matthew Cobb, a lecturer in animal behaviour at the university, said, "As 21st century scientists, rather than 17th century antiquarians, we think it's unlikely this represents a hitherto unknown mode of fish reproduction. Perhaps the shell fell into the pond following some kind of predatory attack, but we're baffled as to how the minnows got to be inside. Certainly we didn't see any crack in the egg." Dr. Cobb and his colleague Henry McGee, head of natural sciences at the Manchester Museum, have written to the New Scientist magazine in the hope that readers will help solve the mystery. Minnows are small freshwater fish, often used as bait by anglers. And if you'd like to see the fish, visit the show notes. They're still there inside the egg. Well, in the photograph anyway. And from the www.lifeslittlemysteries.com website, The Greatest Mysteries of the Planets. This is actually a slideshow, but the text stands alone without the photographs. But if you'd like to see the photographs, just visit the show notes, click on the link to this article in episode 55, and it will give you just that little bit more detail. The first, of course, is Mercury. Mercury is notoriously difficult to study, thanks to its proximity to the scorching hot and blindingly bright sun. Thus, mysteries abound. For example, Mercury has a giant core, perhaps because its outer, lighter layers got brushed off by planetary collisions long ago, but scientists aren't sure. It also has a magnetic field and an atmosphere, both of unknown origin. In fact, the little planet leaks a steady stream of atmospheric particles, suggesting its atmosphere is somehow constantly regenerated. The biggest boggler of all, Mercury's highly elongated orbit is growing more oval-shaped all the time, and it could someday crash into Venus or the Sun. Will its changing path and resultant changing gravitational field disrupt the orbits of Earth and the other inner planets, causing chaos? Venus. Planetary scientists are still working out the details of how a once Earth-like Venus gradually morphed into the hellish hot planet shrouded in a thick blanket of toxic gases we see today. But a bigger mystery regarding Earth's evil twin is why the planet's atmosphere swirls around it 60 times faster than the sphere spins itself. And speaking of Venus spin, no one knows why it goes counterclockwise, unlike all the other inner planets, such that the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. The most intriguing open question of all: does Venus harbour life in its clouds? Some 30 miles up there should be a habitable niche where pressure and temperature are Earth-like. For energy, floating creatures resembling bacteria could thrive off the ample sunshine or chemicals in the atmosphere. Number 3. Earth. You might think we've nailed down the major bullet points about our home planet's structure and formation. but in fact, big zingers remain. We don't know, for example, how all this water got here, and we're uncertain about the nature of Earth's core, which strangely transmits seismic waves faster in one direction than the other. Our beloved satellite has big bloggers too. While most scientists think the moon formed from a chunk of Earth that got knocked off during an ancient impact, the theory has a hole. The theoretical impactor, dubbed Thea, should have left a residue with distinctive characteristics, but it has not been detected. Mars. The red planet, now frigid, barren and seemingly deserted, spent its first 500 million years or billion years as warm, wet and geologically dynamic. Scientists don't know why it changed so drastically for the worse. They also wonder whether a more vibrant Mars once harboured life, and if it did, whether any bacteria like Martian organisms managed to adapt to the harsher environs that took over and are still eking out an existence there. What's more, scientists can't fully explain the planet's hemispheric dichotomy. Smooth, younger, lightly cratered lowlands dominate the planet's top half, while ancient, heavily cratered highlands characterise the southern hemisphere. As for how Mars's two funky, lumpy moons got there, their size and shape suggests they originated as asteroids and were captured by the planet's gravity. However, captured asteroids normally traverse elongated oval orbits, while Phobos and Deimos follow circular paths around Mars. And on to Jupiter. Like a carefully dyed Easter egg, Jupiter is girded by lighter-hued bands called zones and darker bands called belts. But are these stripes merely surface features overlaying a uniform inner ball of gas? Or are the zones and belts actually the tops of concentric cylinders that make up the planet? Whole stripes have been known to disappear without a trace. One vanished in May 2010 that was twice as wide as Earth. Why? Other surface decors, such as the swirling vortex known as the Great Red Spot, are equally mysterious. What power source drives their turbulent motion? Furthermore, early in its history, this gas giant gobbled up great gobs of heavy elements, including more carbon, nitrogen and sulfur than are found in the Sun. How did all that heavy stuff get in there? And is some of it compacted into a solid core deep below Jupiter's surface? Scientists still don't know and are hoping to learn a thing or two when the Juno spacecraft flies past in 2016. Saturn. For 4 centuries, astronomers have contemplated Saturn's eye-popping rings, but none of their attempts to explain the beautiful features have ever seemed quite right. The rings could have formed from the icy remnants of a bygone moon, or from a passing comet torn to shreds by the planet's gravity. They could be relatively young, at just a few 100 million years old, or they might date back to the birth of Saturn more than 4 billion years ago. We just don't know. We're also yet to nail down the dynamics of giant storms and jet streams on the ringed planet's surface, as well as the dynamics of its rotation. 3 different spacecraft have attempted to measure the length of Saturn's day by detecting its natural radio emissions as they soared past. All 3 have turned up different measurements. Uranus. Planets are expected to radiate heat left over inside them from their fiery formation process. But puzzlingly, Uranus radiates little or no heat into space. Perhaps the 7th planet's heat got unleashed during some cosmic smash-up in the distant past. That collision could have also caused the planet's strange sideways spin. Or maybe Uranus somehow self-insulates, keeping all its heat trapped inside. Uranus also drags around with it the craggiest astronomical object known to man, a satellite called Miranda. This strange moon has deep canyons, scrapes, terraced layers and a cliff some 12.4 miles deep, the deepest in the solar system. Miranda's geological mess may have formed from flowing ices in the moon's interior, perhaps heated by gravitational squeezing from Uranus and other moons, oozing out onto the surface. Or perhaps the moon was just shattered several times and came back together, creating its jagged and mottled features. And finally, Neptune, remembering that Pluto doesn't count anymore because it's not considered a full-grown, proper planet. Astronomers have expected Neptune to be a weatherless, featureless world in deep freeze. Instead, Voyager 2's flyby in 1989, the only close look we've ever gotten of this 3 billion mile away planet, revealed a turbulent atmosphere with lighter cloud ripples and raging storms. Surprisingly, the fastest winds ever recorded in the solar system whirl on Neptune, up around 1,300 miles per hour. Driving this activity appears to be Neptune's internal heat. But as the farthest planet from the Sun, why does it hold so much heat? Neptune's clumpy rings also confound scientists, as does its bizarre magnetic field, which emanates from a point offset from the planet's centre. And from the dailymail.co.uk website, the reason we find cartoon villains so dastardly. And it's written by Tamara Cohen. From Captain Hook to Dick Dastardly and Cruella de Vil, their faces portray evil. Now scientists have worked out what scares us most about a cartoon baddie. It's their pointy chin. Warwick University researchers found a downward pointing triangle can make us feel threatened in the same way as an angry face. They believe it is no coincidence the ultimate baddies often have a sinister sharp chin and eyebrows sloping towards a downward point in the middle. 30 volunteers were asked to rate hundreds of pictures of faces appearing on a screen as good or bad, kind or cruel, pleasant or unpleasant. Each picture was flanked by a large picture of a triangle on each side which, without the participants' knowledge, worked as a distractor. When a face was surrounded by downward pointing triangles, people were slower to identify it as positive and quicker to identify it as negative. By contrast, left and right pointing triangles had no effect at all on the results, and upward pointing triangles had a slight positive effect. It is known from previous studies that people pick negative faces, such as sad or angry expressions, out of a crowd more quickly than positive ones. Dr. Derek Watson of the psychology department said simple geometric shapes have an emotional effect upon us, as they carry the features present within negative or positive faces. He added, "Our study shows downward-pointing triangles in particular convey negative emotions, and we can pick up on them quickly and perceive them as a threat." This is the first time this link has been made, although previous research has shown angular lines are seen as negative. Co-author Dr. Elizabeth Blagrove said, "If we look at cartoon characters, the classic baddie will often be drawn with evil eyebrows that come to a downward point in the middle. This could go some way to explain why we associate the downward pointing triangle with negative faces." The study is published in the journal Emotion, published by the American Psychological Association. And if you visit this article in the show notes, it shows you a few cartoon and real-life baddies, and their pointing chins and downward-pointing eyebrows. Check yourself out in the mirror and see where you fit in. In the Russian Arctic lies buried an unfinished railway, built by prisoners of Stalin's gulags. For decades no one talked about it, but one woman is now telling the story of the thousands who suffered there, and there is talk of bringing back to life the abandoned railway itself. From the bbc.co.uk website, Joseph Stalin's Deadly Railway to Nowhere, and it's written by Lucy Ash. The snowdrifts come up to our waists, and the wind stings my face. But Lyudmila Lipatova, a sturdy woman in her 70s, does not seem to notice and hands me a shovel. "This is the place," she says. "Now let's start digging." After a bit, my spade hits something metallic. We scrape away the snow and examine the rusty rails. Along the side of one piece of track I notice some writing. The acronym ZIS, followed by Zavod imeni Stalina factory, named after Joseph Stalin. We are in a nondescript neighbourhood on the outskirts of Salikard, the capital of the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Region. Founded in 1595 as a Cossack and missionary outpost, the city is one of the oldest in the Russian far north. Apart from Rovaniemi in Finland, it is the only city in the world to straddle the Arctic Circle. The city museum boasts a 10,000-year-old baby woolly mammoth, nicknamed Lauba. She made headlines around the world when she was discovered in 2007 by a nomadic reindeer herder. But Salikard is notorious for another reason: its Gulag past. Lyudmila and I had uncovered a tiny section of one of Joseph Stalin's cruelest and most ambitious projects, the Transpolar Main Line. It was his attempt to conquer the Arctic, part of what he called his great plan for the transformation of nature. The scheme was supposed to link the eastern and western parts of Siberia with a 1,000-mile railway, stretching from the city of Inta in Komi Autonomous Republic through Salikard to Igaka on the Yenisei River. Work on the western part started in the early 1940s, but in Salikard construction began after the end of World War II. The labour force was almost entirely made up of enemies of the people, prisoners convicted of political offences. Gulags 501 and 503 were created specially for the railway, and every 6 to 8 miles along the track there were camps. Prisoners built their own wooden barracks, but the unlucky ones in the front units had to take shelter in canvas tents. "You think it's cold now, but it's spring," said Lyudmila. "In winter the temperature can go down to -50 Celsius. Just imagine working in that. And in the summer, the terrible heat, the mosquitoes." Some guards used the insects to inflict merciless punishments. They'd undress the prisoner and tie him up for the mosquitoes, and that was worse than any torture instrument. Lyudmila added that one young man, enslaved on the railway because of his politically incorrect poetry, was stripped naked and tormented in this way after he refused to give the names of some prisoners who had escaped. A 16-year-old girl whose mother had died and whose father returned wounded from the front was desperate to feed her 4 younger siblings. When she was caught stealing half a sack of beetroots, she too was sent off to build a railway. She got 10 years hard labour for that supposedly political crime, explains Lyudmila. But what did it have to do with politics? Lyudmila has many such stories. At the Salicard Museum, where she used to be the director and now a retired senior researcher, she shows me a picture of a young woman with dimpled cheeks and curly brown hair. Nadezhda Kukushina was a bookkeeper at a state enterprise in the Ukraine. When rats got into the safe and chewed up some banknotes, she was accused of embezzlement and sent off to work on the railway. Other prisoners had already endured German prisoner of war camps. When they eventually returned home to the Soviet Union, the authorities branded them traitors and sent them to the Arctic. According to some estimates, 300,000 prisoners were enslaved on the project, and nearly a third of them perished in the process. But Lyudmila says the real death toll and exact number of camps and prisoners are not known, since no accurate records were kept. By the time Stalin died in 1953, over 370 miles had been built, but it was never completed. Cold War Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred responsibility for the construction from the Interior Ministry to the Ministry of Transport, which lacked money and workers to continue the project. The tracks sank back into the tundra. The railway to nowhere, with its huge cost in human lives, became known as the Dead Road. For decades nobody talked much about the ghostly barracks or the rusting rolling stock and rails. Lyudmila once helped to unearth another baby mammoth preserved in the permafrost, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, she began to dig up the area's more recent history. With the help of some other local historians and volunteers, she began collecting letters, photographs and oral testimonies from survivors of the railway. Not far from the modernist sculpture marking the 66th latitude, there is another monument, a steam engine mounted on a plinth. A plaque underneath says the tracks were put down ruthlessly at the edge of the earth between 1947 and 1953. It also says the victims will never be forgotten. Salicard is still home to people who were connected with the camps, either as administrators or guards as well as prisoners. Lyudmila says some of the guards were young conscripts who had no more choice about where they were sent to work than the prisoners. Of course they were always the sadists, but there were normal, decent guards too, she says. Some would allow prisoners time off in summer to pick berries and mushrooms to make sure they had some vitamins in the winter months. Lyudmila sighs and wipes her glasses. Of course it was wrong to build a railway with slave labour. But once they'd started it, and there were so many victims, I think abandoning the project was also criminal. I lead excursions and tell people about what happened. One man, a former prisoner, made a special trip up here, and he just started crying when he saw the rusty engines and the old tracks, she adds. Many of the prisoners believed they were fulfilling a useful and necessary deed, and all of that was just destroyed. It's heartbreaking. I had to catch a plane from Salicard to Novoyurungoy, my next destination further east, because there is no other way to get there. But now that Russia's energy frontier has moved north, The development of the Arctic is high on the Kremlin's list of priorities. Today there are plans to rebuild the railway, and work has already started on a parallel road to connect Salikard with the cities of Nadim and Novy Urengoy, and from there to the rest of Russia. Almost 60 years after the work ground to a halt, the Railway of Bones may finally be getting a new lease of life. From the Fizzorg website. Aliens don't want to eat us, says the former SETI director, and it's written by Jason Major. Alien life probably isn't interested in having us for dinner, enslaving us or laying eggs in our bellies, according to a recent statement by former SETI director Jill Tarter. Of course, Hollywood would rather have us think otherwise. In a press release announcing the Institute's Science and Sci-Fi SETICon event taking place from June 22 to 24 in Santa Clara, California, Tarter, who was the inspiration for Jodie Foster's character in the film Contact, disagreed with both filmmakers and Stephen Hawking over the portrayal of extraterrestrials as monsters hungry for human flesh. Often the aliens of science fiction say more about us than they do about themselves, Tarter said. While Sir Stephen Hawking warned that alien life might try to conquer or colonise Earth, I respectfully disagree. If aliens were able to visit Earth, that would mean they would have technological capabilities sophisticated enough not to need slaves, food or other planets. If aliens were to come here, it would be simply to explore. Considering the age of the universe, we probably wouldn't be their first extraterrestrial encounter either. We should look at movies like Men in Black 3, Prometheus and Battleship as great entertainment and metaphors for our own fears. But we should not consider them harbingers of alien visitation. Tarter, 68, recently announced her stepping down as director of SETI in order to focus on funding for the Institute, which is currently running only on private donations. Funding SETI, according to Tarter, is investing in humanity's future. Think about it. If we detect a signal, we could learn about their past because of the time their signal took to reach us and the possibility of our future. Successful detection means, on average, technologies last for a long time. Understanding that it is possible to find solutions to our terrestrial problems and to become a very old civilization because someone else has managed to do just that is hugely important. Knowing that there can be a future may motivate us to achieve it. On the other hand, concern that searching the sky for signs of life, as well as sending out your own, could call down hungry alien monsters would make a good case for keeping quiet. And a quiet search may not get the necessary funding to keep going. I can see where Tarter is coming from. Let's just hope she's right. About the eating part, at least. The case of the sleepwalking killer, which has been posted by Karen Abbott, on the blogs.smithsonianmag.com website. Rufus Choate approached his client just before the bang of the gavel, when Albert J. Tyrrell was sitting in the dock, 22 years old and on trial for his life. It was March 24, 1846, 3 months after his arrest in the gruesome murder of his mistress. The defendant wore an olive coat with gilt buttons and a placid expression, looking indifferent to the gaze of the spectators. Choate leaned over the rail, raked long, skinny fingers through his thicket of black curls and asked, "Well, sir, are you ready to make a strong push with me today?" "Yes," Tyrrell replied. "Very well," Choate said. "We will make it." Within the week, the pair also made legal history. By then, all of Boston knew the facts of the case, reported in breathlessly lurid detail by the penny press. Around 4:30 a.m. on October 27, 1845, the body of Mrs. Mary Ann Bickford, also called Maria Bickford, aged 21, was found in a disreputable boarding house on Cedar Lane in the Beacon Hill neighbourhood. She lay on her back in her nightgown, nearly decapitated, her neck wound measuring 6 inches long and 3 inches deep. The room was clogged with smoke. Someone had set fire to the bed. A blood-stained razor was found at its foot. The victim's hair was singed, her skin charred. Part of one ear was split open and missing an earring. A man's vest and a cane were splattered with blood. Albert Tyrrell, who had been seen with the victim earlier that night, was nowhere to be found. One witness spotted him bargaining with a livery stable keeper. He was in a scrape, he reportedly said, and had to get away. He drove south to the house of some relatives in the town of Weymouth, who hid him from police and gave him money to flee the state. The following day he headed north into Canada and wrote to his family from Montreal, announcing his plans to sail to Liverpool. Bad weather forced the crew to turn back, and he instead boarded a ship in New York City bound for New Orleans. After receiving a tip that the fugitive was headed their way, authorities in Louisiana arrested Tyrrell on December 5, while he was aboard a vessel in the Gulf of Mexico. Boston newspapers identified the captured man as Albert J. Tyrrell, gentleman of Weymouth. Albert Tyrrell and Mary Bickford had scandalised Boston for years, both individually and as a couple, registering, as one observer noted, a rather high percentage of moral turpitude. Mary, the story went, married James Bickford at 16 and settled with him in Bangor, Maine. They had one child who died in infancy. Some family friends came to console her and invited her to travel with them to Boston. Like Theodore Dreiser's protagonist Carrie Meeber, 50 years hence, Mary found herself seduced by the big city and the sophisticated living it seemed to promise. While in the city she appeared delighted with everything she saw, James Bickford said, and on her return home expressed a desire to reside permanently in Boston. She became, he added, dissatisfied with her humble condition, and she fled to the city again, this time for good. Mary Bickford sent her husband a terse note. "I cannot let you know where I am, for the people where I board do not know that I have got a husband. James, I feel very unsteady, and will consent to live with you and keep house, but you must consent for me to have my liberty." James came to Boston at once, found Mary working in a house of ill repute on North Margin Street, and returned home without her. She moved from brothel to brothel and eventually met Tyrrell, a wealthy and married father of 2. He and Mary travelled together as man and wife, changing their names whenever they moved, and conducted a relationship as volatile as it was passionate. Mary once confided to a fellow boarder that she enjoyed quarrelling with Tyrrell because they had such a good time making up. On September 29, 1845, he was indicted on charges of adultery, an offence the press described as some indelicacies with a young woman, and eluded arrest for weeks. After his capture and arraignment, numerous friends and relatives, including his young wife, besieged the prosecutor with letters requesting a stay of proceedings in the hope that he might be reformed. His trial was postponed for 6 months. Tyrrell came to court, posted bond, and rushed back to Mary at the boarding house on Cedar Lane, where the owners charged exorbitant rents to cohabitating unmarried couples, and where Mary would soon be found dead. Tyrrell retained the services of Rufus Choate, legal wunderkind and erstwhile United States Senator from Massachusetts, and antebellum Johnny Cochran, renowned for his velocity of speech. He once spoke the longest sentence known to man, 1,219 words, and made his mentor, Daniel Webster, weep during a talk titled "The Age of the Pilgrims, the Heroic Period of Our History." Choate derived much of his courtroom strategy from Webster, drawing particular inspiration from his performance at the criminal trial of a client charged with robbery. Webster's defence was based on offence. He impugned the character of the alleged victim, suggesting that he'd staged an elaborate sham robbery in order to avoid paying debts. Webster's alternative narrative persuaded the jurors, who found his client not guilty. Choate kept that case in mind while plotting his defence of Tyrrell, and considered an even more daring tactic, contending that Tyrrell was a chronic sleepwalker. If he killed Mary Bickford, he did so in a somnambulistic trance and could not be held responsible. Choate never divulged the genesis of this strategy, but one anecdote suggested a possibility. Henry Shute, who would later become a judge and well-known writer for the Saturday Evening Post, was a clerk in the law office of Charles Davis and William Whitman, two of Choate's close friends. Choate stopped by often to play chess and visited one afternoon shortly after agreeing to defend Tyrrell. The famous lawyer noticed Shute reading Sylvester Sound, the Somnambulist, by the British novelist Henry Cocteau. He asked to have a look. Choate became interested, then absorbed, Shute recalled. After reading intently a long time, he excused himself, saying, "Davis, my mind is not on chess today," and rising, left the office. It was an unprecedented approach to a murder defence, but one that Choate believed he could sell. On the first day of the trial, prosecutor Samuel D. Parker called numerous witnesses who helped establish a strong circumstantial case against Tyrrell, but certain facets of testimony left room for doubt. The coroner's physician conceded that Mary Bickford's neck wound could have been self-inflicted. A woman named Mary Head, who lived near the boarding house, testified that on the morning of the murder, Tyrrell came to her home and rung the bell. When she answered, he made a strange noise, a sort of gargle captured in his throat, and asked, "Are there some things here for me?" Mary was frightened by his strange state, as if asleep or crazy. The oddest recollection came from Tyrrell's brother-in-law, Nathaniel Bailey, who said that when Tyrrell arrived in Weymouth, he claimed to be fleeing from the adultery indictment. When Bailey informed him of the murder, Tyrrell seemed genuinely shocked. Rufus Choate allowed one of his junior counsel, Annis Merrill, to deliver the opening argument for the defence. Merrill began, in homage to Daniel Webster, by maligning Mary's character, repeating the possibility that she cut her own throat, and positing that suicide was almost the natural death of persons of her character. Furthermore, Tyrrell had been an honourable and an upstanding gentleman until he met the deceased. She had succeeded, in a wonderful manner, in ensnaring the prisoner, Merrill insisted. His love for her was passing the love ordinarily borne by men for women. She, for a long time, had held him spellbound by her depraved and lascivious arts. It was an argument that resonated with the moralistic culture of early Victorian America, playing into the fears about the growing commercialisation of urban prostitution. City dwellers who witnessed a proliferation of dance halls and fallen women distributing calling cards on street corners could be easily persuaded that Mary was as villainous as the man who had killed her. Merrill next introduced the issue of somnambulism. What he acknowledged was a peculiar and novel line of defence. Alexander the Great penned a battle in his sleep, he said. La Fontaine wrote some of his best verses while in the same unconscious state. Condillac made calculations. Even Franklin was known to have arose and finished, in his sleep, a work that he had projected before going to bed. Evidence will be produced to show that it had pleased Almighty God to afflict the prisoner with this species of mental derangement. One by one, Tyrrell's family and friends recounted strange ways he'd behaved. He began sleepwalking at the age of 6, and the spells had increased in frequency and severity with each passing year. He forcibly grabbed his brother and pulled down curtains and smashed windows, yanked a cousin out of bed and threatened him with a knife. While in this state, he always spoke in a shrill, trembling voice. Their testimony was corroborated by Walter Channing, Dean of Harvard Medical School, who testified that a person in a somnambulistic state could conceivably rise in the night, dress himself, commit a murder, set a fire, and make an impromptu escape. On the morning of the trial's 4th day, spectators swarmed the courtroom eager to hear Rufus Choate, that great galvanic battery of human oratory, as the Boston Daily Mail called him. He began by ridiculing the prosecution's case, pausing for dramatic effect after each resounding no. How far does the testimony lead you? Did any human being see the prisoner strike the blow? No. Did any human being see him in that house after 9 o'clock the previous evening? No. Did any human being see him run from the house? No. Did any human being see him with a drop of blood upon his hands? No. Can anyone say that on that night he was not labouring under a disease to which he was subject from his youth? No. Has he ever made a confession of the deed to a friend or thief-taker? Not one word. One stenographer later expressed the difficulty in capturing Choate's thoughts. Who can report chain lightning? During the last hour of his 6-hour speech, Choate focused on the issue of somnambulism, stressing that 12 witnesses had testified to his client's strange condition without challenge or disproof. Somnambulism explains the killing without a motive, he argued. Premeditated murder does not. Here he approached the jury and lowered his voice. The courtroom hushed. In old Rome, he concluded, it was always practice to bestow a civic wreath on him who saved a citizen's life, a wreath to which all the laurels of Caesar were but weeds. Do your duty today, and you may earn that wreath. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned a verdict of not guilty. Spectators leapt to their feet and applauded while Albert Tyrrell began to sob, his first display of emotion throughout the ordeal. Afterwards he sent a letter to Rufus Choate asking the lawyer to refund half his legal fees on the ground that it had been too easy to persuade the jury of his innocence. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com website, and the bandwidth was provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. To bring the podcast to a close, a couple of stories from the www.yourghoststories.com website. The first is entitled Demonic Child. I have to be honest, but I'm a bit embarrassed about sharing this story. But it has been a few months since I had this eerie encounter, and the image of the face is still emblazoned in my mind, accompanied by many unanswered questions. Not long before I had ever heard of black-eyed kids, due to much research online, finding many stories of them, I in fact had an encounter with one. I'll never forget it. It's still very vivid in my mind. I was sitting in my car at a shopping centre parking lot, checking my bank account on my mobile. I happened to look at the car next to me and noticed a child between 12 or 13 looking back at me. I smiled and looked away. Then something registered in my mind that the kid didn't really look right. I looked back, and the creepy kid was still looking at me, staring actually with what can only be described as a sinister smile on his face. It felt like he was looking right through me. I stared back, trying to make the rude boy look away. That's when I noticed that his eyes were completely black, with no sliver of white, like hollow, looking similar to doll's eyes. His face seemed frozen in that creepy stare. He never blinked. I began to have an overwhelming and, what seemed to me, an irrational fear of this kid. My heart was racing and I was literally afraid for my life. I slowly reached up and locked the car door, completely aware that he was still staring at me, almost mocking me, enjoying my fear. He could see it. I was so disturbed by him that I decided to move to another, further away parking spot, in hopes that that boy was not watching and would think that I actually just left altogether. As I watched from a distance, I noticed two young females in their mid-20s approaching the car, talking and laughing amongst themselves as they opened the doors and entered the car. Strangely, neither of them seemed to act as if anyone else was occupying this car, not acknowledging this creepy child in the car I'd seen only moments earlier. Then all of a sudden, as they backed out and began to drive off, in the back seat in the rear window popped up this little head, and with that black-eyed child's face staring directly at me, as if he knew I was still there and had been watching me. He watched me until they were completely out of that parking lot and could not see me anymore, and thankfully I could not see him. I shiver every time I think of it. Curious to know, I did some research online to see if there was some eye condition that caused the eye to be completely black and not due to dilation. I happened across a site that described exactly what I saw. I just hope that I do not see one again. Our second story from the yourghoststories.com is entitled A Headstone May Have Saved Lives. My name is Saoirse, a somewhat obscure Irish name, and I've been wanting to share this story online for a while now, but I wanted to find a site that cared for reality rather than fiction. What I'm about to tell you is, to the best of my knowledge, factual. That or my entire family has been playing a hoax on me since I was 7, which I doubt. First of all, I think it's important to set the context of how I know about this experience. Though I'm very interested in the paranormal, I seem to be about as sensitive as a roll of wallpaper. When I was a child, I had quite a few experiences. The younger, the more interesting. But after the age of 12 or so, I've nothing to report, much to my own disappointment. I guess I'm in the majority that way. While I personally recall some of these incidents, the one I'm about to relate took place when I was 3 years old, so I don't remember a bit of it. My sister, who is 6 years older than me, and my parents have described it to me, all in varying detail. My mother enjoys telling it, but my father will only admit it happened if he's had a couple of beers. He's quite superstitious, and while my sister agrees that it took place, she doesn't see what a big deal it is. Some sibling rivalry, perhaps. By all accounts, it's a long story, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. During the early years of my life, my family, that is my parents, my sister and my brother, who is 3 years older than me, took annual trips during the summer. We live in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and generally went to Portrush, Portstewart, Donaghadee and Donegal, anywhere with a coast and a good ice cream parlour. In the summer of 1990, when I was 3 years old, we went to Donegal, which is quite a long road for a young family. My brother, and I remember this from other incidents sadly, was terrible travel sick right up until he was a teenager, and trips were punctuated with hideous pauses at the side of roads, if we were lucky. Sometimes travel sickness tablets helped, but unfortunately they often didn't. That year we made it the whole way to Donegal, but had run out of his medication by the time we got there. My dad stopped at the first chemist we passed, and we disembarked and crowded inside, glad to stretch our legs. Now, as a toddler, I had platinum blonde hair, bright blue eyes and a fair amount of puppy fat. Adults generally took one look at me and started cooing and gushing, which was absolutely fine by me. The chemist was no exception, and as her co-worker went with Mum to find the right pills for my brother, this brunette lady came out from behind the counter and approached me and Dad. The usual small talk took place, asking where we were from, how long we were staying, where we planned on going. As it was early in the afternoon, Dad told her we were going to the beach after we'd reached our bed and breakfast, and proudly showed me off while my sister sniffed shampoos. Eventually, we all were settled, left and got back in the car. We hadn't been on the road long before my brother announced that he felt sick. A declaration of nuclear war wouldn't have elicited such an efficiently panicked reaction from my family. Anyone who grew up as or with this type of sibling will know precisely what I mean. Plastic bags were organised. I was placed on my sister's lap, and she squeezed as far away from my brother as possible, and Mum started scanning the surroundings for distractions. About 10 minutes later, she spotted a graveyard up ahead. It was an old, fairly decrepit one, which most would agree is interesting, and as we'd never been tourists in a cemetery before, or since, it most definitely proved a distraction. One last note about myself as a 3-year-old. I had a terrible habit of taking what my parents call mad dashes. For absolutely no reason, I would suddenly pick a direction and go tearing off, leaving my family in the dust. It earned me a few smacks because I didn't yet comprehend road safety, but all that deserved to do was make me wait until my parents weren't paying attention before running. With that in mind, it's hardly surprising that after 20 long, boring, well, to a toddler, minutes in the graveyard, I waited for the opportune moment and careened off, and my parents, abashed as they are to admit it, took a few minutes to notice. No one knows what was in my head during the interim between my disappearance and my parents finding me. My mother likes to conjecture, but I'm the only one who would know, and I haven't a clue. At any rate, it took my family 10 minutes to find me. What they found was a little disturbing. I was clinging to a knee-high statue of an angel atop a headstone. My father tried to lift me up, but I wouldn't let go, and screamed bloody murder when he tried to drag me away. Alarmed, they tried to persuade me, but I wouldn't have none of it, and they ended up waiting for me to get bored. Eventually I let go. "It's okay," I said. She says it's okay now. No one in their right mind would attribute much to the ramblings of a toddler, but as Dad bent down to pick me up, he looked at the headstone. It was a little girl's grave. Her name had been Saoirse, and she had died on that day's date, 100 and change years before, and she had been 3 years old. Like I said, Dad's a superstitious fellow on the quiet, and he completely freaked out. The rest of the family ranged from disinterested, my brother, to it's a coincidence, my sister, to oh, cool, that's my mum for you. But Dad utterly lost it. Everybody was packed back into the car and we went on to our destination. My brother was ill along the way, of course, where Dad refused to take us to the beach, saying instead that we would go tomorrow. We went out for dinner and my father spent the entire day staring at me, as if expecting the Grim Reaper to leap out and nab me at any moment. We only stayed a few days because Dad needed to work and nothing eventful happened to us. The weather turned bad, which is completely typical of Irish summers, so we never did go to the beach. Back into the dreaded car we went, prepared for my brother's tummy antics, and we started the long journey home. As we neared the chemist we'd stopped at, Mum insisted we stop there again so she could get painkillers. I suspect her headache was hangover-induced. My dad was carrying me, funnily enough. He'd been doing that the whole weekend, as we entered. Immediately the brunette lady let out a shout and rushed towards us, where she paused and started smoothing my hair down. She looked ready to cry. "Oh, thank God," she kept saying, which was making my family uncomfortable, and my dad creeped out. He asked what was wrong. "The day you came by and said you were going to the beach," the lady said, very upset, "a father and his wee girl were washed off the beach and drowned. I was sure it was you." To this day, my parents maintain that Dad and I would have died that day in a freak wave, if not for my odd behaviour with the statue. All I can say for certain is that it's a long story and could be nothing more than a string of impressive coincidences. But even now I find myself starting to cry when I tell it. I'm not religious, though I'd count myself as spiritual. But every now and then my mother says a prayer for the other Saoirse. Well, everyone, that brings a close to episode 55 of the Mysteries Abound podcast. It's been a while coming, but as I've said before in other podcasts, life just sometimes gets in the way. So until next time, whether it be Origins, Mysteries Abound, or the occasional Bizarre podcast, this is your host Paul saying thank you everyone and bye for now.